Yo, what's up? All right, so Easter Sunday. Hope you're having a great weekend. I don't really celebrate Easter, but I'll take the chocolates. It's all good. So considering chocolates and how so many of us love chocolate, I wanted to talk today about the role of chocolate, sugar, and good old belly fat. So here's how this works. There's nothing wrong with sugar. There's nothing wrong, not sugar, but there's nothing wrong with chocolate in moderation. Good quality chocolate, at least 70% dark raw cacao is what we're after. We want to limit the milk and sugar ingredients in the chocolate because, that's the bad stuff, more or less. I thought I'd take this opportunity to talk about and reinforce the impact that sugar has, and specifically on belly fat, okay? So when we eat sugar, again, in the form of chocolate or candy or refined carbohydrates, or if you're going to scoop sugar out of the jar with a spoon, it doesn't really matter. Here's what's going to happen. A couple things. So we have what's known as blood sugar, right? So when you eat, right, your blood sugar tends to rise, and that spike, I'm just going to kind of draw a graph here if we can even see this. Hopefully you can see that. If not, I apologize. But we have this graph here, and generally when we eat, right, this is a fasted level, okay? When we eat something, our blood sugar will rise as it's metabolized and broken down into glucose, and it enters the bloodstream. Okay, so we'll get a little spike, and then we're up at about there. Now what happens at the same time, I'm just gonna make sure is that coming up properly? All right, so I'm just gonna make sure we can see this. So our blood sugar rises slightly. Now what happens as the blood sugar rises, the sugar can't just kind of circulate in the blood all day, otherwise it'll lead to some serious damaging consequences. So what happens is the pancreas secretes a hormone you've probably heard of called insulin. So insulin is then secreted, and it rises in response to mimic the blood sugar rise. So blood sugar rises, insulin rises, and what happens is as the insulin rises, blood sugar falls back down to a resting level, and then insulin will fall back down to wherever its level was. Okay, so we get this kind of normal states, rise, back down, and so forth. But unfortunately what happens in a lot of cases when we're eating sugar and refined foods is that sorry, if you can hear a crying baby upstairs, that's Oscar. Welcome to my life. So what happens is if you're eating foods that are traditionally known as high glycemic index foods, right? So foods that are very quickly broken down into sugar, they're going to tend to spike your blood sugar to a much greater degree, okay? So what's going to happen is when that happens, there's a greater load of sugar in your bloodstream. There's then going to be more insulin that's going to have to pop into the bloodstream from the pancreas. So we're going to get this overshoot of insulin, and what that's going to do is it's going to really take a lot of sugar out of the blood, store it in the muscles, liver, fat cells, and then we're going to get this undershoot of blood sugar. So the blood sugar drops below normal, and this state here, okay, low blood sugar, is known as hypoglycemia. And that's when you start feeling all jittery and like, oh, not so good. Okay, so this cycle continues. You don't feel good, you feel jittery, you feel anxious, you need another fix, so you go get another piece of chocolate or coffee or something that kind of get you up again. That's the typical kind of insulin blood sugar cycle. So what does this have to do with belly fat and fat storage? Well, here's the thing. Insulin is a anabolic hormone, which means that it builds things, it stores them, okay? So what that means is that when insulin is secreted, it is going to have a tendency, well, not have a tendency, but it does store, it takes glucose, so we'll just call it big G, and this is the bloodstream, okay? We have a lot of big G's in here. We've got to get the glucose out of the bloodstream. We've got to maintain a normal blood sugar level. Insulin, I'm just going to use these triangles as insulin, color those in, nice, like my drawings, right? I'm going to color those in. Insulin is like a bouncer, okay? It's not a bouncer, but one of those cool guys that has VIP access to all the clubs, right? It knows the bouncers. So we have all these muscle cells, for instance. I'm just going to draw a muscle cell over here, a muscle cell over here, and then we've got fat cells, for instance, right? I'm just going to give you some examples. So what insulin does is it knocks on the muscle cell and it says, hey, I got some cool dudes and some hot girls who got to bring inside the club. Can you let me in? And the muscle cell says, sure, as long as you have insulin, we can hook you up, because there's a specific transporter inside the muscle cell called the GLUT4 transporter, which is like the chaperone inside the club, comes to the door and says, hey, come on in. Okay, so it's like an escort, kind of brings them in. And that's how blood sugar leaves the blood and into the muscles. So insulin has this impact. It takes sugar out of the blood, puts it in the muscles, but it also does that in the fat cells. Okay, so the more you spike your insulin, the more insulin is going to be in the blood, and the more of it is going to be stored in the fat cells once your muscle glycogen, as we talked about in the last video, your stores of carbohydrates inside your muscles, once that carbohydrate store in the muscles is satiated, if you want to call it that, there's going to be no more place to store this, okay? So, and it's a very small amount per muscle cell, really. It's pretty limited. So all this extra glucose, all this extra sugar that we're eating, these refined carbohydrates, the chocolate, all the sweets, all of these are going to have a favorable destination, which is going to be our fat cells, because the fat cells really have no limit to how big they can grow. They're like balloons. When you blow into a balloon and they grow in size, that's essentially what's happening with these fat cells. Okay, so the more you're eating sugar, the more you're spiking your insulin, and the more that insulin is then taking that sugar and storing it inside your fat cells. So that is not a good thing, okay? So it doesn't really matter. And again, here's the thing, is that we're all genetically made up a little bit differently. So some of us have a tendency to store fat in our hips and thighs, generally women. Men, generally around the abdomen area. And that's just, there's obviously hormonal differences, and we have different receptors for the various different areas of our body. But nonetheless, the bottom line is that the more sugar you eat, the more you're going to spike your insulin, and the more fat you are going to gain, because this whole sequence of insulin going up and down over time leads to insulin resistance, which eventually becomes, or is known as, type 2 diabetes, which we know is heavily correlated with obesity and whatnot. Okay, so the name of the game is, if you're going to enjoy your chocolates, make sure they're as good as healthy as possible. Dark chocolate is the way to go, and just obviously in moderation, right? Don't do it every single day. Keep it on the down low, and you'll be much better off from a belly fat perspective. We'll see you in the next video.